Hey everyone, I will continue to keep covering protests, but this video is going to be the first of a new kind of series that I'm making. It will be like a podcast that you can listen to on the go, but I'll also have like photos and visual effects if you want to watch too. This video is going to tell you all you need to know, mostly, and maybe a little more about the death penalty. Number 1. From 1972 to 1976, the death penalty was illegal in the United States. The modern era of the death penalty in the U.S. began when the Supreme Court re-legalized it with a 1976 decision. Number 2. Not all people who are executed are unwilling. 1 out of every 10 people executed in the modern era has intentionally waived his or her appeals in order to speed up the execution process. Number 3. 1,493 people have been executed in the modern era. Only 16 of the 1,493 people executed have been women. Number 4. That said, a woman named Tiffany Moss was condemned to death this year in Georgia. She rejected a plea deal that would have given her life in prison and instead was sentenced to death by a jury. There are also women on death row in California, Texas, and a few other states. Number 5. 1999 was the year with the most executions in the modern era, with 98 people being put to death across the country. Number 6. We are currently on pace to have the least number of executions since 1991 this year being 2019. 4 people have been executed through the first 4 months of the year, and while that's probably going to increase in the next few months, because there's like 7 executions scheduled next month, it would appear that we're going to have less than 20 executions this year, which would make it the least since 1991. Fact number 7. The death penalty is a punishment on the books in 30 states. By the time this video comes out, that will likely be 29 states, however, because New Hampshire just repealed their death penalty, and their governor can veto it, but they're going to override him. Fact number 8. Once convicted and given the death penalty, inmates get a number of both state and federal appeals, and they can also challenge a number of things not related to guilt, including how effective their trial lawyers were and whether or not their crime should be able to carry the death penalty in the first place. Number 9. These appeals have resulted in a number of rulings, some of them applying to large numbers of people on death row. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that minors could not be sentenced to death for crimes committed before the age of 18, which took a number of people off of death row. That said, there have been minors who have been executed in the modern era before the Supreme Court could make this ruling. Number 10. Because of the number of appeals that death penalty inmates get, and because of how backlogged the system is, it usually takes years to get from conviction to execution. Every execution this year has been for a crime that was committed in 1995 or earlier. The inmates sit on death row the entire time. This fact in particular blew my mind because I'm only 22 years old, which means that every single execution that's happened this year was for a crime that was committed before I was even on Earth. 11. Even right before an execution is to take place, a court can choose to stop an execution. Mere hours or even minutes before an execution, courts have stopped executions for a number of reasons in the past. 12. Likely only 5 of the 30 states with the death penalty look like they're going to pull off an execution this year, now that Ohio has suspended its process indefinitely. 13. Ohio is suspending the process for the same reason that executions have been way less common in recent years. States have had a harder and harder time getting drugs for the lethal injections, and the drugs that they've been getting have been resulting in botched executions. 14. Recently, states have tried to use midazolam as the sedative in the lethal injection cocktail. So many midazolam executions have been screwed up that states have started to abandon its use. And some scientists have even theorized that midazolam does not actually have the properties necessary to work even in ideal situations, which would mean that all midazolam executions are botched executions by definition. 15. Use of the death penalty and the rate of people being sentenced to death have gone way down in the past 15 years. There are a number of reasons for that, one of the major ones being the fact that companies have stopped selling lethal injection drugs to U.S. states that perform the death penalty. 16. 37 states have not executed an inmate in the past 5 years. 17. Texas is the state which has performed the most executions in the modern era by far. Harris County alone has more executions than the state with the second most executions. On the screen right now is the room in which more than 600 Americans have been put to death by Texas. 18. The most efficient state when it comes to executions and death sentences, however, is Virginia, with Texas coming in a distant second. By that I mean that Virginia has executed 75% of the people it has sentenced to death row, as opposed to Texas's rate of only slightly more than 50%. This means that for everybody who has received a death sentence in Texas, about half of them have either died from other causes, been released, or are still on death row. 19. The electric chair has been the most prolific execution method in the 20th century in the United States, though in the history of the country, hanging has been used far more. 20. The last time the electric chair was used was actually last year, 2018. The state of Tennessee used the electric chair on 2 inmates in December. That's right, they're still executing people with the electric chair in 2018. The picture on screen is of the only active electric chair in the United States and in the world, located at the Riverbend Maximum Security Prison in Nashville. 21. At least one more inmate is scheduled to be executed by electric chair in Tennessee this May. 22. In Texas, it's common for motorcycle gangs that support the police to park outside the execution building and rev their motorcycle engines as cop killers are put to death. In the first execution of 2019, around 100 of them showed up, and the motorcycles revving could be heard inside the execution chamber. An inmate was actually interrupted while saying his last words in December of 2018 by the absurdly loud revving that could be heard even in the death chamber. 23. Only 10 states have killed an unwilling inmate in the past 5 years. A few other states have executed inmates, but all of them have been volunteers who waived their appeals. 24. The death penalty costs states more than life in prison does. It can be anywhere from a few $100,000 to millions more. 25. That said, while the numbers change depending on the poll, a decent majority of Americans support the death penalty, especially in cases of extreme violent crimes. 26. When adjusted for population size, Oklahoma carries out the most executions in comparison to how big their population is. Executions are actually on hold there after 2 recent really botched executions. Fact 27. In one of the botched executions that got international attention, the sedating drug failed to paralyze the inmate, leaving him to writhe in pain until he eventually had a heart attack. In the other execution, the last words of the condemned man were, "My body is on fire," and the autopsy showed that the lethal drug that he had been injected with was potassium citrate when it was supposed to be potassium chloride. They accidentally killed him with the wrong drug. That's right, the state's execution team made the kind of mistake that would lose you 20 points in a high school science project. 28. On the topic of the Sooner State, Oklahoma is developing what they see as the execution method of the future. Since the failed injections, they have been developing a plan to gas prisoners to death, this time with pure nitrogen. It's supposed to be relatively painless and effective. 29. That said, it will be a while before this is implemented. The state government promised a 5-month review after the method is proposed and before it's used, and the method has not been officially submitted yet, which means that the 16 Oklahomians currently eligible for execution will not be executed until the middle of 2019 at the earliest. Number 30. California has the most prisoners on death row by far at 741. California has only actually executed 13 prisoners in the modern era. Number 31. California's death row is at this point pretty much an enhanced life without parole. Recently, voters rejected a measure to end the death penalty while approving another that will supposedly speed up the process. A court ruled that since the will of the people was to speed up the execution process, California must come up with a legal means to do so and try to implement it. But so far, the dilly-dallying has continued. Recently, the new governor, Gavin Newsom, put a moratorium on the death penalty, and so it's unlikely to be used or advanced at all for the next couple of years. 32. There have been multiple ballot measures on the death penalty, and pretty much all of the recent ones have gone in favor of keeping the death penalty and even speeding up the process. These measures have taken place across the United States. Number 33. 165 people have been taken off of death row and released from prison after it was discovered that they were innocent. The most recent was March 29th, 2019. Clifford Williams, Jr. was on death row for 43 years before being released and declared innocent. 34. Florida is the state in which the most death row prisoners have been exonerated and let go from jail. 35. The shortest time it took for a death row prisoner to be released was 1 year. The longest time was the case I just mentioned, that of Mr. Clifford Williams. 36. Both of the men exonerated from death row last year were foreigners. One is a Mexican national and the other one was a Salvadorian. 37. In my home state of Oregon, a fight broke out in 2014 between a governor's administration and a death row inmate over whether an execution should take place. The reason why this is notable is which sides they were on. In a bizarre twist, Gary Haugen asked the state to execute him, while Governor Kitzhaber refused to allow the execution to go forward and placed a moratorium on executions in the state. Haugen then challenged Kitzhaber's right to do this and asked the courts to overturn Kitzhaber's block so that he could be executed. He initially succeeded, only to have the Oregon Supreme Court overturn that ruling. 38. Staying in my home state, a death sentence is the only optional criminal sentence in Oregon. Oregon only executes inmates that volunteer or waive their rights to appeal and agree to be executed. And as mentioned, they don't even get executed anymore even when they do this. This is actually true for a couple of other states too. 39. Pennsylvania had 48 death warrants signed from 2014 to 2018. Not a single person was executed by the state of Pennsylvania during that time. Number 40. Lethal injection is the way that the death penalty is administered in almost every state across the United States. But with shortages of drugs have come attempts to expand the methods of killing. The aforementioned nitrogen hypoxia, firing squads, and the electric chair have all been suggested as alternatives. 41. In most states, the death chamber is located at the same prison as death row. But in a few states like Texas and Ohio, the death chamber and the death rows are at different locations, and the prisoners have to be driven to the death chamber on the day of execution. 42. A condemned prisoner can order a special meal to have as a last meal before their execution in every state except for one. In Texas, a prisoner ordered a boatload of food and then ate none of it, and so Texas banned the practice. 43. Alaska and Michigan have never had the death penalty, and Wisconsin only had one execution before abolishing it in 1851. 44. States schedule execution dates in different ways. In some states like Texas, regular judges sign an order and pick a date for inmates. In other states like Tennessee, the state Supreme Court does this. In a number of other states such as Alabama and Pennsylvania, the Department of Corrections themselves set the dates. 45. Ohio has execution dates set years in advance, while Georgia and Alabama kind of spring the announcement that an inmate is to be executed about a month before it's supposed to happen. Texas and Tennessee are kind of in between both extremes. They set their dates a couple of months before the execution is to take place. 46. This doesn't seem to really affect whether or not motions to stop an execution are successful, since most of the attempts to save the prisoner's life are filed and dealt with at the last minute. 47. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals is an interesting case study for this. All 9 of its members are Republicans, and all of them are elected statewide by the very pro-death penalty Texas public. Despite this, and despite a recent retirement from one judge who was the most critical of the death penalty, this court frequently delays or stops executions from taking place on a number of legal grounds. You would think that the much more bipartisan Supreme Court would stop more executions than a completely Republican court, but that isn't the case with the current Supreme Court and the current Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. 48. The death penalty across the world varies greatly based upon where one lives. It's almost non-existent in Europe and Latin America, but it is legal in almost all of Asia and Africa, although recently some African countries have moved away from it. 49. Execution methods are pretty similar around the world, with hanging, beheading, firing squad, and lethal injection being the most common. And finally, 50. Also common across the world is opposition to the death penalty, with 120 nations having previously voted for a moratorium bill in the United Nations. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe if you enjoyed. I'm going to be coming out with some more very similar videos soon about the death penalty and about other things too.